Say you want to get into the car selling business. You save up and eventually get a few cars to sell, but the local big car dealerships perceive your small business as a threat. They sabotage your business by accusing you of stealing their cars, change the laws so they can legally take your cars, and when you still refuse to back down, they straight up murder you. This happened in America, not with cars, but with cattle, and they call it the Johnson County War. Even today, 130 years later, the conflict paints people's perceptions of how a wealthy elite can exploit a corrupt government and become a bloodthirsty curse. But not your government, though. I'm sure they're just fine.
To me, it was really a volatile time. In Wyoming, the cattle roamed for miles and miles during the winter, and then when there was a roundup in the spring, there would be a lot of baby calves. These rich cattle barons were established in this land, this beautiful Wyoming land, way before the Homestead Act. And so they had been using all this land for miles and miles as their own. And so when the Homestead Act was passed, and a lot of people started flooding west, and they settled in Wyoming.
The story goes that in mid-19th century Wyoming, late-season settlers stuck on the Oregon Trail had no choice but to winter over and were forced to abandon their cattle to their fate. When spring came, the settlers noticed to their surprise that their abandoned cattle actually got through the winter in pretty good shape, which is not a surprise really when you think about it. This is bison country after all. Now, after the native tribes had been forced onto reservations, the land was basically a giant free-for-all. It was a big open range. As early as 1870, ranchers and investors were springing up in the territory and were beginning to make fortunes off the cattle business. And it was a tempting business model. If you were an investor, you only needed enough investment capital to bring in a herd and build a couple of shacks. You didn't pay for the land since it was in the public domain, and you didn't need to buy any feed for the cattle. You didn't even need to really watch them. You just let them wander around and graze. Many of the men who invested in this business probably wouldn't fit your mold of what you think a typical cattleman looked like, but you'd be surprised at who shows up when the rate of return on investment is around 35%. More than a few investors were younger sons from European nobility, particularly Britain. Since they weren't firstborn, these men couldn't inherit their family's titles, but they still had access to their family's wealth. For the ranch hands and cowboys actually doing the work, the two busiest times of year were the spring and fall roundups. In the spring roundup, everybody's cattle were gathered, sorted, and branded, and in the fall, the cattle were again gathered and sent to market. These roundups lasted months and could employ hundreds of men. Just like a lot of other tough jobs, cowboys subscribed to the work hard, play hard philosophy, and so these roundups also served a social purpose. After work, the men would get together for horse races, card playing, or just talking and telling stories by the fire. In 1873, 5 cattle ranchers formed what would become the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, or WSGA. Over the next couple of decades, the WSGA's members included some of the richest and most influential men in Wyoming, who also began to enter public office. The wealthiest owned million-dollar homes in Cheyenne, which became sort of their home base. Cheyenne's population exploded and claimed over 11,000 residents by 1890. The symbol of Cheyenne's opulence was the Cheyenne Club, where the town's elite socialized and networked over the finest foods and drinks imported from back east. While cattle barons bankrolled large-scale cattle operations, a different kind of investor was also making their way into Wyoming territory. These were people investing their lives and futures, looking for a new life, a fresh start. Many took advantage of government programs like the 1862 Homestead Act that allowed homesteaders to claim 160 acres of land, provided they lived on the land, improved it, and paid some small processing fees. The number of homesteaders, or nesters, as the cattle barons called them, steadily increased. Of the nesters, one man said, "They did not have much of this world's goods, any of them, but their cabins were their castles, and they were as much lords of all they surveyed as any one of the cattle barons." Quite a few of these immigrants were college educated and brought their specialized skills to new up-and-coming towns like Buffalo, the largest town in Johnson County. By 1890, Buffalo could boast more than 1,000 residents who were hoping they could convince the railroads to build through their town. The people whose ranches and cabins dotted the landscape also earned a reputation for helping each other out. They had to. Wyoming can be a very unforgiving place to live. It was customary to put up an out-of-work cowboy for a week or two, and during Wyoming's dark winters, the settlers entertained each other with social events. One small rancher remembered, The largest dance given in the winter of 1888 to 1889 was at the now celebrated TA Ranch. It was a large, roomy house, had just been built, and the floors were smooth and nice to dance on. That rancher was Oscar Flagg, better known as Jack Flagg. Jack had come to Johnson County in the early 80s and was friends with many of the people there, including another cowpuncher named Nate Champion. After his death, Flagg would be described, probably pretty accurately, as fiery, quick-tempered, and a bitter hater of his enemies. Acquaintances declared he was never known to go back on a friend. 1890 was a watershed year for the West. The census taken that year concluded the frontier, the line dividing civilized settlement from untamed wilderness, had finally disappeared. 1890 was also the year that Wyoming became a state. The citizens elected Francis Warren as their governor, but a few weeks later he left office to become one of the state's senators. The other senator was WSGA member Joseph Carey, who owned the CY Ranch near Casper. Amos Barber became the state's acting governor, with a special election set for 1892. Although there had been years of prosperity, times were getting tough for the cattle barons. Throughout the 1880s, the large cattle herds had consistently overgrazed the land, and beef prices were dropping back east. Furthermore, a disastrous winter in 1886 and 1887 killed off as many as half the animals. The animals that did make it were scrawny and barely fetched a third of the price they had just a few years earlier. Owners recorded huge losses, with one man even losing 120% of his holdings. When he was asked how that was possible, he replied, "I lost all that I had, and it took me 20% of what my herd was worth to find it out." Many ranches folded, and unemployment soared for the rank-and-file cowboys and ranch employees. For the men who could get work, they found the business had changed. Cattle owners were looking to cut costs however they could. 27 wagons had participated in the spring 1883 roundup. By 1888, the number was down to 3. Flagg recalled, "There was no fun, no excitement of any kind. The barons had instructed their foremen to allow no gambling around the wagons, no horse racing on company horses. The good old times were gone, and the boys were beginning to realize that they must take up land and establish homes for themselves, or leave the country." When homesteaders staked their claims, they did so on the highest quality land they could get to, which of course denied the cattle barons access to that land. There were ways of dissuading homesteaders from blocking ranchers' access, from buying the homesteaders out to other, more intimidating methods.
The purpose that the landowners in Wyoming, the cattle baron, was to kill the settlers with the pretense that they were cattle rustlers rather than settlers looking for a place.
The WSGA perspective was that homesteading and other smaller cattle operations enabled what they said was the greatest threat to their trade, cattle theft. The murder of Ellen Watson and James Averill in 1889 had provided the cattle barons with a blueprint on how to handle stubborn settlers, and that included portraying anybody who crossed the WSGA as cattle rustlers. A network of Cheyenne newspapers used every opportunity to assist the wealthy business owners. Among them was Asa Mercer, owner and editor of the Northwestern Livestock Journal. Asa had gotten famous back in the 1860s when he had organized Mercer's Belles, a group of eligible young women and Civil War widows he brought to the Pacific Northwest to marry the men settling there. Now he was in Wyoming, comfortably making a living as a mouthpiece for the cattle barons. Using their connections, the WSGA maintained its authority over all matters beef. When it was pointed out that maybe the government should have control over cattle regulation and not a private organization, the WSGA agreed. A new government body, the Wyoming Livestock Commission, was formed, and then immediately staffed with WSGA members. And some of the policies these guys came up with were doozies. The most infamous was the Maverick Law, where orphaned, unbranded calves were seized and only sold to WSGA ranchers, no matter who had a claim to them, but that was by no means the only one. The Livestock Commission also created a rule that allowed the commission to seize suspected stolen cattle as they were brought to market. They could also confiscate the proceeds from any sale. If these had been your cattle, you now had to make a trip from wherever your ranch was to Cheyenne to prove your case to the commission and get your money, which could take days. And you can guess whose cattle was always being suspected of being stolen. As Jack Flagg described the situation, the scheme was so secretly worked by the thriving commission that no one had an opportunity to take any counteraction. And as the shippers were all poor men, they were not able to take any legal steps right away. Despite these rules, many small ranchers kept working their herds because, well, they had to. Their livelihood depended on it. But as large-scale ranches continued to lose money, the cattle barons doubled down on cattle theft accusations, particularly in the Powder River country, the area covered by Johnson County. Now, had any cattle been stolen in Johnson County? Of course, people steal stuff everywhere. But was it happening on the scale the WSGA alleged? Probably not. Johnson County citizens actually had a reputation for being honest and law-abiding, which isn't surprising if you've ever lived in a rural area. Everyone knows each other's business, and the quickest way to get yourself ostracized is to screw over your neighbors. But that didn't keep the cattle barons from painting Johnson County as a lawless haven for cattle thieves. One of the issues the barons had to deal with was the criminal statute itself. In order to successfully convict the person of larceny, a prosecutor had to prove to a jury the accused had taken the property from a victim with the intent to deprive said victim of the property. That means you had to find out who the cow had belonged to, which might not be easy if the cow was missing a brand or the brand had faded. You also had to take into account the worth of the stolen property. Property worth $25 or more constituted a felony and could send you to prison for up to 10 years. Anything worth less than $25 was a misdemeanor. The max time a thief would get was 6 months in county with a $100 fine. By the 1890s, the going rate for a cow had dropped to $15 to $20, well below the felony threshold. And some modern businesses are faced with a similar situation today. For example, in 2014, California passed Proposition 47, which changed the felony threshold for most theft crimes to $950. Since then, Prop 47 has been cited as emboldening criminals to steal from stores, since they know the value of what they steal won't come near $950, and the worst case scenario is that they'll get a misdemeanor citation if they're caught. Today's California business owners have reacted to the thefts by closing up stores to prevent further losses. Wyoming's cattle barons reacted a different way. They went on the offensive. Johnson County did have some effective law enforcement. For a good part of the 1880s, the Johnson County sheriff had been Frank Canton. Canton had a reputation as a tough, relentless man, even ruthless. He caught Bill Booth, who was wanted for murder, and oversaw his hanging, the only legal hanging done in Johnson County. There's no doubt Canton was good at his job, and he might have given some of the townsfolk a bit of a Judge Dredd vibe. Part of the issue might have been that Frank Canton wasn't actually Frank Canton at all. In reality, he was Josiah Horner, a Texas outlaw with a history of robbery and murder who had escaped from prison. This wouldn't be confirmed until decades later. You see, there's an unofficial code in the Old West that we don't see much these days. And part of that code was that when you met someone, you didn't pry or ask about what they had done in their past life. You just judged the person that was standing in front of you. People came out west to start over, so don't go digging up dirt and mind your own business. Sheriff Canton didn't run for re-election in 1886. Instead, he took a job as a WSGA range detective, investigating reports of cattle theft and making sure nothing happened to WSGA property. When Canton decided to run for his old job again in 1888, he lost the election to William "Red" Angus, a Buffalo saloon owner who was fairly popular around town. So Canton kept his job for the WSGA. Now, one of the men who utilized Canton's services was another Frank Wolcott. Frank Wolcott liked to be called by his Civil War rank, and so Major Wolcott had made a prominent name for himself in Wyoming. He'd briefly been a judge and even presided over one of Belle Drury's cases. Small world. Major Wolcott had a reputation of being abrasive and bossy and overbearing and bullying and, well, just a guy who didn't like to be told no. By the 1890s, Wolcott was hemorrhaging money and believed the main reason for this was the cattle rustling that had to be running rampant throughout the Powder River country. In the summer of 1891, Wolcott, along with several others, would become the architect of one of the most notorious plans in the West, involving hit squads, assassinations, and eventually an armed takeover of an entire county. How do we know this? Because one man confessed.
This is a story about an Idaho guy that goes to Wyoming looking for a job. There was a video on the History Channel by Roger Mudd, and even at that time, George was still a mystery. Why did he go to Wyoming? Why did he do that?
One of the issues you come across when researching the Johnson County War is knowing which sources to trust. For the people involved, this was a bitter personal conflict. It can be tough to filter through all the finger pointing and propaganda. We need a credible, objective, outside source. And one of our best bets is this man, George Dunning. Now, odds are you've never heard of him. In fact, this is his only known photograph. But George's story and his 44-page handwritten confession might give us our best chance at uncovering the truth behind the Johnson County War.
Dow Deming was my great-grandfather, and he had an older brother by 1 year, George Dunning. They were born in Michigan, and in 1877, the father, Josiah Dunning, and the two sons traveled west. The Homestead Act was encouraging people to leave the east and travel west, and so they got as far as Idaho. Josiah Dunning, he had 1 year's training as a doctor, so when he came west, he practiced as a doctor. He died at this ranch called Wickahomie that was built by his son Dow. There's a lot of history written about Dow Dunning because he got into politics. He saw how politicians were treating the people, the ranchers in Idaho, so he decided he would get into politics. So there's really a lot of great things written about him. There is just a minute amount of information about George. George moved around a lot. He worked on ranches. As far as we know, he never had any property. He owned a ferry boat, and that was one of his jobs. He worked in mines. And I think the last thing that I read about him was he was a caretaker on a ranch. Everybody knew him, it seemed like, but he never married. I would say there weren't very many people in Hawaii County in the early 1900s, because even now there still aren't very many because it's so desolate. Beautiful, but desolate. Way back in the early days, this was early 1900s, the schoolhouses in Hawaii County were really far apart. And kids had to travel a long way to get to the schools. And there were a lot of rowdy boys, and they had a reputation of chasing off the school teachers. I suspect most of the school teachers were young women. And so they would come in and just cause such a ruckus that the teacher would leave. So the families got together, approached George, asked him to be the school teacher. He agreed. And so he was at the schoolhouse when all the kids came. The rowdy boys showed up. They didn't take off their spurs or their chaps or their hats. They were just thinking school was going to be dismissed really quickly. And George was at the back of the school welcoming. He walked to the front of the schoolhouse, drew a picture of a bird flying, put an eye on it, and then walked back to his desk and quickly turned around and shot the bird through the eye. School was in session. That was the way schools were back in those days.
George's teaching methods probably wouldn't fly today. However, in southwest Idaho, he was well-liked and known for being even-tempered. It was noted that George never turned his back to any man. He never went looking for any trouble, but could more than hold his own in any given situation. But even a good reputation is no guarantee for financial success, and by early 1892, George was tapped out. He had sunk all his money, $1,484, into a mine near Silver City, and George was waiting for his claim to be paid off. By this point, George was broke, horseless, and had even been forced to pawn his revolver. While he was walking the 60 miles to Boise, George received word that a man wanted to talk to him about working for a cattle outfit in Wyoming. The job was being put out by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, who'd had problems with cattle rustling.
He was involved in mining and was supposed to get some money that was going to, help him live. And he hadn't received it by the time he got this invitation from a group in Wyoming to come and help them kill rustlers. There were people that were rustling cattle, and they needed help. In Idaho, he had belonged to two cattlemen's associations, and there was always trouble.
Almost immediately, George wrote, he could tell something was wrong. George had had his own experience with an Idaho Stock Association and had himself been accused of illegally branding cattle, so George didn't exactly trust rich cattlemen. But George had to walk through Nampa, and while there he was approached by the town mayor, John Stearns, who told George about the cattle thieving going on in Johnson County. George had to go handle his business in Boise, but he told Stearns he would meet his associate back in Nampa in a few days. A few days later, George was introduced to Hiram Ijams, secretary of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Ijams was at the top of the WSGA and Livestock Commission leadership and intimately knew the inner workings of the association. Inside Mr. Stearns' Nampa office on March 7, 1892, in an attempt to recruit George, Hiram Ijams would bear the WSGA's darkest secrets. Ijams began the interview by telling George about the cattle rustling that was hurting the association's business. According to George, Mr. Ijams said the Stock Growers Association had owned stock on the range too long to be run out of the country by an outfit of thieves, and if it was necessary, the association would fight the thieves until the last one of them was wiped out of existence. The conversation then took a more sinister tone. Mr. Ijams confessed that the association had spent thousands hiring men to kill off the thieves, but the killings so far had not had the intended effect. Mr. Ijams said the Stock Association were mistaken in regard to the effect produced by the killing off of a few thieves by men who were hired by the Stock Association. That instead of terrorizing the rascals, that the thieves were becoming more bold in committing their depredations upon livestock, and that the thieves were getting more on the warpath every day of their rascally lives. Ijams even gives George specific details about a few of the murders and mentions them by name: the hanging of a man by the name of Wagoner, a horseman, and the lynching of Averill and Cattle Kate, and about the killing of Tisdale and Jones last fall and the assault on Nate Champion and his partner on Powder River last fall. Now we're going to talk about Nate Champion a whole bunch next episode, and I've already talked about James Averill and Ellen Watson's murder in a prior video, which I'll link to, but it's worth breaking down these other names that Ijams mentioned to George. Wagoner refers to Tom Wagoner. He was a horse trader east of Johnson County who owned about 1,000 horses. According to his wife, early on the morning of June 4, 1891, 3 men claiming to be sheriff deputies showed up at Wagoner's house with an arrest warrant and took him away in handcuffs. Ijams confided to George that the man in charge of the arrest party was Tom Smith, a former deputy U.S. Marshal who had numerous connections in Texas. The warrant that Smith showed Wagoner was fake, which Ijams confirmed to George. Ijams said Smith and party read a bogus warrant to Wagoner and took him a short distance from home and hung him. Wagoner's body was found hanging from a tree over a week after he had been taken from his home. This lynching could have inflamed the locals against the cattle barons, but the problem was that Tom Wagoner was not what you would call a good victim. The newspaper article about Tom's death describes him as not regarded as a very bad man, but was shrewd enough to never let the chance of turning over a dollar go unimproved. He was quiet, avoiding every show of hospitality or good fellowship, and was penurious to an extreme. Tom had actually been indicted for living with his old lady Rosa and having kids with her without marrying her. When the coroner's inquest was held at Tom's house, the same newspaper reported, "There was not a chair or bed in the house. A bench, a couple of logs on end, and boxes were the only seats. Everything indicated that not a dollar had been spent that could possibly be avoided. The dinner was so rocky that none of the visitors could eat. Everything was squalor and misery and filth." It wasn't until the next year, after shooting started and the two sides were looking to demonize each other in the court of public opinion, that Wagoner's case would receive more attention. Only then would Jack Flagg write, "Could any devil in hell perpetrate a more heartless and diabolical piece of cruelty? Just think of it. These men coolly, calculatingly, and for a few dollars paid by the cowmen, take a man who has never done them any harm in the world, away from his wife and little children, and strangle him to death." Wagoner's lynching was only the first life loss in 1891. On November 28th, Orley Jones, more commonly known as Ranger Jones, was last seen driving a wagon on his way home from Buffalo to buy flooring for his cabin. A couple of days later, John Tisdale was seen in Buffalo, appearing unusually nervous. Tisdale had been a college student back east, and had even been Teddy Roosevelt's foreman when Roosevelt owned cattle. But John was nervous about being killed. He was so nervous he bought a shotgun for the trip back to his ranch. On the morning of December 1st, as he passed a gulch, someone began shooting at John. The first round clipped the handle off his revolver, and the second knocked him into the bed of his wagon. He bled to death on his children's Christmas presents. Whoever killed Tisdale led his horses and wagon about a half-mile down a gully, where the horses were also killed. A few days later, Jones's body was found, even though he had been killed prior to Tisdale. Jones had been shot in the back 3 times from below as he rode across a bridge. A passerby thought he might have recognized Frank Canton in the area around the time of Tisdale's murder, and Canton was arrested, but was released a couple of days later. Canton quickly left the state, and when additional evidence was located, a $30,000 warrant was put out for Canton. According to what iJams told George, though, this wasn't a problem. Mr. iJams said the Stock Association had a great many influential friends all over Wyoming. He said the association paid no attention to the courts in Johnson County, that all the courts were on their side. He spoke about Frank Canton being arrested for killing Jones and Tisdale, said the evidence was very strong against Canton, but that Canton's friends were obliged to prove an alibi for him. Said the affidavits in regard to Canton's proving an alibi had been got up to fit the case and were false as far as the truth of the matter was concerned. That it was no trouble for the Stock Association to procure affidavits to fit any case. According to iJams, the killings had created too much attention among Johnson County's residents, and so the hit squad had to stop. For 1892, instead of another hit squad, the WSGA would recruit an entire mob, dozens of men, to go to Johnson County and kill any rustlers they found. Any man who joined them would be paid $5 a day, plus a $50 bounty for every man killed. iJams still had some planning to do and an upcoming meeting to attend, but if the plan was approved, he wanted to get it underway before the spring roundup. He told George the estimate was that when about 30 of the thieves were killed off, that 300 or 400 people who were in sympathy with the thieves would get up and leave the country the best way they could. The cattle barons would then swoop in and collect the cattle. iJams told George he would mail him a letter when the plan was approved, and to see if he had a few friends who were interested that he could bring along.
So when the Stucklers Association from Wyoming contacted George, somehow they came to Idaho looking for a man that was good with a gun. I do not know how they discovered George, but they specifically came looking for him. And because he didn't have a horse, a saddle, a gun, and I wasn't even sure where he was living, he was kind of in a bad way financially.
In his confession, George wrote, "I could not conceive how iJams could imagine that I and my friends were composed of the right material for a mob. Well, I think I know why. It involves an area near a modern campground in Owehee County named China Flats. That area got its name through the actions of a man named William Vickers. 5 years before iJam's interview with George, Mr. Vickers had roped a Chinese guy on nearby Whiskey Hill Road and dragged him to death. The victim's body was found near the flats and presumably gave the flats its name. Vickers had also stabbed a guy in the gut during an argument and then escaped the Silver City jail. The guy was a public menace, and the Owehee County Sheriff deputized George Dunning to bring him in. After almost a week, George found Billy Vickers asleep with some of his friends and forced one of the men to handcuff Billy. Then they all went to a nearby house for breakfast. What? Everybody's got to eat. As Vickers walked into the house in front of George, the women and children of the house suddenly blocked George from getting inside. One of Billy's friends pushed a revolver into his hand, while also taking a shot at George. Billy and his friend exchanged shots with George, while the lady of the house also tried to grab George's rifle. George was tempted to shoot into the room where Billy had fled to, but some kids had run into the room, and George didn't want to risk hitting them. George made a tactical retreat, but figured Billy would head to another nearby ranch house. There, George surprised Billy in the kitchen and told him to put his hands up. Billy went for his gun, and George shot him in the head 3 times. When George went outside to leave, Billy's friend also shot at George, but hit another man in the leg. George shot this young guy also in the head. The incident made the front page of the local papers and made such an impression that years later, the same week that George was meeting with iJams, he was remembered as the man who acquired some reputation by killing the desperado, Bill Vickers, a few years ago. News of this incident probably impressed the WSGA leadership so much that when it came time to hire killers, the secretary himself made the trip to pitch the idea to George. The thing was, George had a reputation for working against Idaho's Stock Association. The way he figured it, he had more in common with the folks the WSGA was targeting. He decided that either iJams thought George could be bought off, or the whole thing was a fake. It wasn't until iJam's letters started arriving that George realized it was real. George did his homework and asked around about Johnson County. He wrote, "The other men I saw and had conversations with seemed to have about the same idea about matter in Johnson County. They all spoke of the people as a law-abiding class of people, and all agreed that the Wyoming Stock Growers Association of Cheyenne had been importing assassins from Texas and other places in Wyoming for the purpose of shooting people from ambush, whom the Stock Association styled rustlers or thieves." George then reached a fateful conclusion. If iJams meant anything by his propositions to me, I supposed he meant to recruit an outfit of men and have them go to work in Johnson County in his cow outfit, and then see after he was well acquainted with the men how many men he could select out of the outfit that were of the same stripe that Frank Canton had been represented to me to be. George is going to Wyoming, but just to work cattle.
But he still suspected that there was something up that wasn't right. But he eventually went, but before he went, he gave the letters that he received from the Stockmen's Association and other information that he had to prove that he was going to Wyoming in case something happened or he would get into trouble.
When iJams sends George some money for the trip to Cheyenne, the first thing George does is get his revolver back from the pawn shop. He arrived in Cheyenne on April 2nd on the 5 o'clock train and almost immediately is met by iJams.
So when George Gunning was hired and went to Wyoming, they met him in this town, got him all set up, a place to stay, a horse, a gun, a hat, I think even a bedroll. They wanted to put him up in a fancy hotel. He refused. He settled for something lesser. He got some clothes. We think maybe that's when he had his picture taken. We're not exactly sure, but it just kind of seems to fit the picture. He's really well groomed. He looks like a brand new suit, and that is the only original picture that we have of him. So they got him all set up, and then he said that he talked to some of the other people that were there that were going to do the same thing he did, and he knew something was amiss.
From the other hired men, George learns the full extent of the plan. The mob would first come to Buffalo and kill off what men they wanted in town, that they would shoot or hang up the sheriff and his deputies, and would depose the civil authorities and keep possession of the town until the Stock Growers Association could have their own officers take charge of the courts of Johnson County. The standard rifle cartridge the U.S. Army used at this time was a .45-70, meaning the bullet was .45 caliber and the cartridge was loaded with 70 grains of black powder. It's a stout, powerful load that was known to bruise many an Army private's shoulder with its recoil. The rifle iJams buys for George is chambered in .45-90, with over 20% more powder and one of the most potent rounds available in the West at the time. George also learns another bit of info about how far up this plan reaches. When he brings up the idea that maybe the Army would intervene and stop the mob from moving north, he's told Governor Barber had the running of the soldiers and he would not allow them to molest the mob, that Barber helped plan the raid the mob was about to make, and that the officers at Fort Russell were friends of the stockmen. On April 5th, iJams informs George the plan has been approved by all the WSGA members and drops some big names to George, among them Senators Kerry and Warren and Governor Barber. The scheme was now authorized to proceed, and the organizers wasted no time with its execution. That evening, a special train leaves Cheyenne, bound for Casper, equipped with horses, supplies, and over 50 men from Texas, Wyoming, and one lone man from Idaho. There's no going back now. Cheers. Normally I don't start a video with a shot, but if you're going to be talking about Nate Champion, you might as well step on the gas. Giddy up. Today, Nate is barely remembered in modern American culture, except among one group, die-hard freedom-loving Westerners. To them, he's like William Wallace, with a six-shooter. And a big part of Champion's mystique has to deal with his role in not one, but two legendary gunfights. Okay, that's actually the beginning of Silverado. Really good movie if you've never seen it. And now Nate's story is even crazier. Nate Champion was born in Texas, one of 19 brothers and sisters. He came up to Wyoming on one of the many cattle drives and decided to stay in the Powder River country. Now, this was the 1880s, when the cattle business was still fairly profitable. In Wyoming, Nate first got work as a ranch hand for some of the larger beef outfits. Here he met and became acquainted with other Johnson County cowboys, including Oscar Jack Flagg and Orley Ranger Jones. Flagg had bought his own cattle and shared a brand with a few other cowboys named the Hat brand. Back then, owning your own cattle automatically prohibited you from working for any of the big ranches that were members of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, or WSGA. One of the largest ranches was the 76 Ranch, whose foreman was a British immigrant named Fred Hess. Hess was an educated man whose mannerisms and overall attitude could come off a bit hoity-toity to some of the other cowboys. But he was not the kind of guy you'd want to cross. He could throw down if need be. During the 1888 roundup, the EK brand, one of the largest still remaining in the county, hired Curtis Ed Spa as their foreman. Spa was new to the area, and Nate helped him get the lay of the land. According to Flagg, some of the other foremen told Spa who was blacklisted and who wasn't blacklisted but shouldn't be hired because, they're trouble. Spa then asked Champion about these supposed troublemakers, and Champion told him they'd been accused of branding mavericks, but they were hard workers and good men. Spa ended up hiring 4 of them, including Ranger Jones. Obviously, Jack Flagg couldn't be hired, he was on the blacklist, but he asked Spa if he could tag along just to look after his own herd of a few hundred cattle, and Spa agreed. These decisions ended up costing Spa his job at the end of the roundup. Flagg accused Hess of conspiring to get Spa fired and of just being an all-around shady guy, while Hess called Flagg and his friends a gang and accused them of all sorts of shenanigans. Flagg had also gotten into it with Mike Chauncey. Chauncey was the foreman of the CY brand, Senator Joseph Carey's own outfit, and during the 1889 roundup, Chauncey and Flagg ended up fighting over a yearling cow. Apparently a whip might have been involved, but neither man would forget the fight. Point is, many involved in this situation hated each other on a personal level, even without all the cattle drama. Now, Nate wasn't as brash and outspoken as Flagg, but he still had a reputation as a guy you didn't push around, and 2 incidents in 1891 would bring matters to a head for him. Now, by this point, Nate owned about 200 cattle, a fraction of the thousands that occupied the range. The first incident happened during the spring roundup. Champion saw that a few of his cattle were mixed in with Mike Chauncey's herd and offered to get his out. Chauncey told him to not worry about it, he'd get Nate's cattle out for him. When Nate left, Chauncey took Nate's cows and ran them off towards the hills, which now meant days of having to track them down. According to Flagg, that of course vexed Nate, and he had some words with Chauncey over the matter. Chauncey never forgave him, though apparently afterwards he was very friendly. Apparently Nate returned the favor and shooed off some of Chauncey's cattle as well. The second incident took place after the roundup, when Nate rented a cabin and moved his herd into the Hole in the Wall country on the west side of Johnson County. A WSGA-affiliated member argued that Nate didn't have a right to graze there, even though nobody owned the land and Nate's herd was only a tenth of the member's herd. Remember, nobody pushes Nate Champion around. He'll graze his cattle where he wants to. For the cattle barons, this type of rebellious behavior couldn't be tolerated. It's time to make an example out of Nate Champion. By this point, Nate had rented a small one-room cabin with his roommate, Ross Gilbertson. The cabin had a door that was so low, most men had to crouch to get in, and the cabin was so cramped, the door couldn't open all the way without hitting the bedpost. On Sunday morning, November 1st, 1891, Nate and Ross slept in the cabin's bed. Nate briefly woke up and played with a cat. Nowadays, he probably would have watched a couple of YouTube videos. Maybe click the like button, hit the bell icon so he received notifications when his favorite channels posted new videos. Maybe he would have even subscribed. The button's down there somewhere. Nate had gone back to sleep when suddenly the door to the cabin flew open and 2 men entered with guns drawn. One of the intruders told them, "Give up, boys, we've got you." Nate asked them who they were and what they wanted, while acting all sneaky and reaching for his own revolver, hanging on a bedpost. The intruder again told him, "We've got you. You might as well give up." And with that, the shooting started. The intruder's first round was so close to Nate, it showered his face with burnt powder and mortally wounded Nate's pillow. Nate returned fire as the intruder shot at him and missed. The men ran outside with Nate in hot pursuit. Nate later recalled, "The first thing I saw was a Winchester standing against the corner of the cabin, and another lying on the ground a few feet away. I took the first gun in my left hand, and just as I grasped it, a man jumped around the corner and threw down on me, but did not attempt to shoot. I jumped inside the door and fired a shot through the chinking of the cabin. When I got outside again, I saw a man going through the brush some distance from the cabin, but he disappeared before I had time to get a shot at him. Nate and Ross checked the area and found their assailant's staging camp nearby. Among the abandoned items was a bloody tarp. Months later in Idaho, Hiram Ijams, secretary of the WSGA, confided to George Dunning that 4 men had tried to kill Nate Champion in that cabin. Nate had shot one of the men up the coat sleeve and another through the ribs. That man is believed to have been Billy Likens, who was dead from his wound by the end of the year. Other men in Cheyenne confirmed the story to George. They explained to him how the original intent had been to hang Nate near the cabin and that the Winchester rifle that Nate had picked up and used belonged to Frank Canton. Nate, along with 2 friends, went searching up a nearby canyon for more evidence, where he located Mike Chauncey. Nate was able to persuade Chauncey to name the men who would come after him. In a month, at least one of the men who went with Nate and confronted Chauncey, John Tisdale, was dead, killed along the road south of Buffalo. Ranger Jones was also killed shortly before Tisdale, although his body wouldn't be found until after Tisdale's. It's believed at least part of the reason these men were targeted is because they knew who the assassins were that had tried to kill Nate Champion. These shootings put the entire country in a state of high alert, bordering on paranoia. The Johnson County Commission issued a $5,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of whoever killed Tisdale and Jones. In fact, on the same page of the Buffalo Bulletin from December 17, 1891, you can find the reward notice, the interview with Nate Champion, and the next column over, a sort of manifesto from the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association. We are opposed to such spirit and management of any corporation or enterprise as tends to oppress the people and rob them of their just rights. We are not enemies to capital, but we oppose the tyranny of monopolies. Even the weekly column written by the soldiers stationed at nearby Fort McKinney focused on the killings. In February, Nate Champion testified at Joe Elliott's preliminary hearing and identified him as one of the men who had tried to kill Champion. Joe couldn't pay his $5,000 bail and spent the next couple of months in jail. According to a local newspaper, Nate's persuasive testimony convinced nearly everyone that Elliott was mixed up in the affair or that he has a double whom he cannot get rid of any too soon for his own good. For the WSGA, the hit squad's failure to kill Champion meant a change in tactics. In the springtime, instead of a small team of killers, the stockmen would unleash a heavily armed mercenary force to eliminate any and all opposition in Johnson County. If the mercenaries, or invaders as they've come to be called, could get to Buffalo quickly, they could decapitate Johnson County's leadership in one fell swoop. Then they could install their own friendly government and finish picking off whatever resistance remained. It's an audacious plan, to say the least. This idea's origins can be narrowed down to 2 men, Frank Walcott and William Billy Irvine. Both men owned large neighboring cattle ranches in Converse County. The Johnson County invasion could be called these men's brainchild, which was then put into place by Hiram Ijams, the guy who recruited George Dunning. At the time, Ijams was the secretary of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, as well as the Wyoming Livestock Commission. Wolcott and Irvine certainly had help from other interested parties. A collection had been taken up and raised over $100,000 to fund the invasion. Other men in positions of power were able to assist in other ways. For example, in late March, a communique went out from the governor's office to all state militia units, ordering them to only take orders from the governor's office and nobody else, like, say, a local sheriff. Frank Canton, who had laid low out of state after a warrant had been issued for him, came back and had his $30,000 bond paid off by WSGA members. Joe Elliott also arrived in town after his bail was also paid off. Tom Smith, a former deputy U.S. Marshal who had connections in Texas, brought 25 hired Texans with him to Cheyenne. All that was needed was the final word. And so, after the plan was approved by the WSGA's membership, on the night of April 5, 1892, George Dunning found himself on a special private train along with over 50 men rolling north towards Johnson County. At Casper, the men disembarked and saddled their horses. Telegraph wires were cut so advance warning of the invaders' approach couldn't be given. The ride north was not an easy one. The invaders were caught in a late spring storm and questions arose about who was actually calling the shots. See, Major Wolcott thought he should be in charge. The whole thing was his idea. But apparently it's tough to flex on a gang of hired killers. Dunning observed, on the morning of the 7th of April, the mob were called together and told that hereafter the Texas part of the mob would be in command of Tom Smith and the rest of the mob would be in command of Frank Canton, for the mob to obey orders and ask no questions. With that settled, the men rode towards a nearby friendly ranch to rest. Dunning says the Texas men were about played out. While there, they were paid a visit by Mike Chauncey, who reported that Nate Champion was currently staying at the KC Ranch, about 16 miles away. The invasion's leadership had a heated debate about what to do next. Their objective was Buffalo. That was where the county's leadership was. But on the other hand, he really wanted to kill Nate Champion. The invaders finally decided to quick go to the ranch, kill Nate, then head as fast as they could to Buffalo. They still had time and the element of surprise. They rode out that night, and before the sun was up on April 9th, the men took up positions around the KC ranch. When Nate stayed there, the ranch consisted of a cabin and a stable south of the river along the main road.
George was part of that. There was two men in a cabin, and that seemed to be the first group. He realized that they were up to no good, the cattle barons, and so he tried to warn someone, the leader of the, I don't call them the killers, the leaders of the killers, made him get back to where he was not able to warn the people that were going to be killed.
As the invaders waited for a sign of life from the cabin, George had an idea. Why not just go up to the cabin and see if he was there? George was unknown in the area. He wouldn't raise any suspicion. Afterward, George told the Johnson County Sheriff he planned on alerting the men inside about the mob's presence. But when George brought the idea up to Wolcott and Canton, they said the idea was crazy. If there were any friendlies in the cabin, they were out of luck. Soon a man came out of the cabin and walked toward the river to get some water. He was quickly and quietly rolled up. A few minutes later, his partner, a younger man, also came out and was rolled up near the stable. Shortly afterward, a young cowboy, Reuben Nick Ray, stepped out from the cabin's doorway, apparently looking for the other two men. From the stable, a man named C.D. Brooks, known as the Texas Kid, fired the first shot, dropping Ray. As the rest of the mob opened fire, a small man was seen quickly grabbing Ray and pulling him inside the cabin. That man was Nate Champion. On April 9, 1892, Nate Champion would do two things that would cement his place in Western history. First, he would single-handedly hold off an attacking force that outnumbered him 50-1 for an entire day. And second, he wrote about it while it happened. Throughout the morning, the invaders traded shots with Champion, who was able to score hits on some of his opponents and kept everybody's head down. Every hour the invaders spent fighting Champion was another hour lost getting to Buffalo. Problem was, how soon would anybody find out about the fight? During a lull in the shooting, a wagon and rider were seen approaching from the south. It was Jack Flagg and his teenage stepson who were on their way to Douglas. As he got closer, he was recognized by the invaders. About 7 of the men mounted up and gave chase. Jack told his son to cut one of the horses loose from the wagon, and the two rode for their lives. Jack was able to keep his pursuers at bay by pointing his rifle at them, but he was reluctant to fire. He only had 3 rounds. The two made it 30 miles to Friends and began spreading the alert about the siege at the KC. Meanwhile, the invaders made use of Jack's abandoned wagon. They loaded it up, pushed it next to the north wall of the cabin, and set it on fire. Before long, the cabin was engulfed in flames. Everyone knew what had to happen next. Either Champion was going to die in that cabin, or he was going to make a run for it. Through the smoke, the invaders saw Nate sprint from the cabin towards the south, armed with a rifle and revolver. He might have been trying to conceal himself in the smoke from the cabin while making his way towards a ravine. As he approached the road, 2 men opened fire on Nate. Nate shot back, but he took a hit. More men fired at him. The fight was over. Suffering from multiple gunshot wounds, Nate Champion finally collapsed. Somebody pinned a note on Nate's body that read, "Cattle thieves, beware." That's when someone noticed a small book on Nate's body. The men soon discovered that in the book's pages, Nate had documented his point of view of the siege while fighting off his attackers. A journalist with the group took the diary, but it's since been lost to history. Since then, the diary's existence and exact wording have become hotly controversial. The most common version of Nate Champion's diary is undoubtedly altered and embellished. A version published a couple weeks after his death is considerably shorter and lacks some of the artistic flourishes in the more famous version. I'll put the shorter and probably more accurate version in this video's description. But I do think the longer, more common version serves a valuable purpose. Nate Champion's strength, grit, and determination were universally celebrated by his friends, and even grudgingly admired by his enemies. Even if it's not exactly historically accurate, Nate's published diary poetically eulogizes a man who went down swinging, fighting against all odds for his ideals, for his friends, his livelihood, even his own existence. And so in that spirit, I present to you Diary of Nate Champion. Me and Nick was getting breakfast when the attack took place. 2 men with us, Bill Jones and another man. The old man went after water and did not come back. His friend went out to see what was the matter, and he did not come back. Nick started out and I told him to look out, that I thought that someone was in the stable and would not let them come back. Nick is shot, but not dead yet. He is awful sick. I must go and wait on him. It is now about 2 hours since the first shot. Nick is still alive. They are still shooting and are all around the house. Boys, there is bullets coming like hail. Them fellows is in such shape I can't get at them. They are shooting from the stable and river and back of the house. Nick is dead. He died about 9 o'clock. I see smoke down at the stable. I think they have fired it. I don't think they intend to let me get away this time. It is now about noon. There is someone at the stable yet. They are throwing a rope out the door and drawing it back. I guess it is to draw me out. I wish that duck would get out further so I could get a shot at him. Boys, I don't know what they have done with them 2 fellows that stayed last night. Boys, I feel pretty lonesome just now. I wish there was someone here with me so we could watch all sides at once. They may fool around until I get a good shot before they leave. It's about 3 o'clock now. There was a man in a buckboard and one on horseback just past. They fired on them as they went by. I don't know if they killed them or not. I've seen lots of men come out on horses on the other side of the river and take after them. I shot at the men in the stable just now. Don't know if I got any or not. I must go and look out again. It don't look as if there is much show of me getting away. I see 12 or 15 men. One looks like... I don't know whether it is or not. I hope they did not catch them fellows that run over the bridge toward Smith's. They are shooting at the house now. If I had a pair of glasses, I believe I would know some of those men. They are coming back. I've got to look out. Well, they've just got through shelling the house like hail. I heard them splitting wood. I guess they're going to fire the house tonight. I think I will make a break when night comes, if alive. Shooting again. I think they will fire the house this time. It's not night yet. The house is all fired. Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again. Nathan D. Champion. Now, any frontier people, and that includes people in the Old West, need to be good problem solvers. Case in point, the town of Casey, Wyoming. In the early 20th century, when the people who lived at the Casey Ranch wanted to incorporate as a town, they wanted to keep the ranch's name and call the town KC. But they couldn't because the government wouldn't allow the use of initials or acronyms on the paperwork. So the folks just spelled out KC on the paperwork. Problem solved. In the spring of 1892, the KC Ranch had a different type of problem. Nate Champion and Nick Ray had just been murdered after a day-long siege outside the burning ranch house. 50 gunmen hired by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, or WSGA, had planned on going to Buffalo to kill the town's leadership and install their own puppet government. But Champion's stand had cost them an entire day, and worse, the local settlers and cowboys now knew about their presence. What were they going to do now? Jack Flagg, one of the local ranchers, gathers local men who stalk the invaders, while others gallop towards Buffalo to alert Sheriff Red Angus. That night, as the invaders move along the road to Buffalo under the eye of some Johnson County settlers, one of the settlers' rifles accidentally goes off, spooking the invaders. They take off cross-country. At this point, the invaders are in a tough spot. Their horses are smoked, they're low on supplies, and now they know the entire county is up in arms against them. The idea of getting to Buffalo and taking it over, that's done. They need a spot to hole up until help can arrive. One of the invaders, Charlie Ford, is the foreman for the TA Ranch a few miles away. The invaders manage to get to the ranch by sunup and begin fortifying the ranch's buildings. In Buffalo, news of an armed gang of killers only miles away sends the town into a frenzy of pandemonium and activity. This is their worst fears realized, but they're not helpless. The town's store owners open their doors and hand out rifles and ammunition to anyone who will ride towards a TA ranch and solve that problem. By the early morning of April 11th, enough citizens have gathered around the TA ranch to begin a proper siege. The invaders' wagons are captured and their supplies looted, including cases of dynamite and the hit list of 70 people that were to be killed in Johnson County. For 2 days, hundreds of Johnson County citizens exchanged gunfire with the surrounded invaders. Nobody is seriously hurt, although there are some pretty close calls. Today, the ranch's barn still has the cut-out gun ports, bullet holes, and even the engraved initials of the men who were besieged there. Wolcott and his men are isolated, and they know they need to get word of their situation out to their friends in high places. A couple of riders are able to escape the siege and make it to the nearest telegraph station. But the invaders cut the wires on their way to Buffalo, remember? Finally, on April 12th, Governor Barber is alerted about the invasion's fate. The best help for the invaders is the Wyoming State Militia in the area. But again, telegraph wires down. There are U.S. Army troops at Fort McKinney, but Barber has no authority over them. He needs to phone a friend. He immediately sends a telegram to the President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison, which famously begins, "An insurrection exists in Johnson County, in the state of Wyoming, in the immediate vicinity of Fort McKinney, against the government of said state." Barber neglected to tell the president exactly who was insurrecting against who. When he doesn't immediately get a reply, he telegrams Wyoming's 2 senators and WSGA members, Francis Warren and Joseph Carey, for assistance. The 2 men go to the White House and personally wake up President Harrison in his bed, who authorizes federal troops to intervene. By 2 a.m., companies C, D, and H of the 6th U.S. Cavalry are marching towards the TA Ranch. For the invaders, the troops arrive in the nick of time. Some of Johnson County's citizens were Civil War veterans, and they had converted one of the invaders' wagons into a bulletproof mobile barricade. As the sun rises on April 13th, they begin slowly rolling towards the ranch house and barn from the west. The plan is to get close enough to chuck the dynamite into the buildings, then snipe the invaders as they're forced out. But right as the barricade approaches the ranch, the army arrives. The invaders agree to surrender, not to the Johnson County government, but to the federal troopers. Their guns are confiscated and the invaders are taken to Fort McKinney, with Johnson County citizens watching every move. Now, the invaders figured the troops would support them in their cause, but you have to remember that the soldiers were stationed literally down the road from Buffalo. They frequently visited the town and even published a little column in the local paper. They knew firsthand about Johnson County life, and they knew better than to believe some of the stories they heard from the invaders. The soldiers' job was to simply keep the peace, which they did. With the invaders all rolled up, Buffalo's townsfolk turned their attention towards a somber necessity. On April 15th, hundreds of people attend Nate Champion's and Nick Ray's funerals. Nate had been shot over 20 times, and Nick's body was burned beyond recognition, but still, open caskets. And as one man later wrote, a strange sight it was too, the black and charred trunk of Ray's with a floral surrounding. Sheriff Angus now has the biggest criminal case of his life to investigate. But with all the suspects in federal custody, he isn't allowed to interview any of them. He asks Governor Barber to release the men into his custody, but the governor says it's too dangerous, not until peace has been restored in Johnson County. Never mind the fact that the people who brought all the violence are now under arrest. While he's telling the sheriff this, the governor is also making plans to transfer the invaders to Fort D.A. Russell, right next to Cheyenne and even further out of Sheriff Angus's reach. A few days later, the invaders are escorted to Douglas, where they board trains for Cheyenne. If you Google Johnson County War, this photograph is one of the first that comes up. This famous photo of the invaders was taken at Fort D.A. Russell after they had been moved out of Johnson County. However, if you closely examine it, you'll notice that someone is missing from the invaders' ranks. Where's George Dunning?
And then the military came to rescue George Hid. He is the only one that was left at a ranch. He hid in a barn. And then when everything died down, everyone had left, military, cattle baron, hired hands, everyone. He walked, and there was no horses, no way to get back anywhere. His horse was gone, and so he walked to Buffalo. When he showed up, he was arrested.
George's story is so bizarre, obviously Sheriff Angus is incredulous. He decides to do some fact-checking on George and his story, and on April 19th writes to the mayor of Nampa, Idaho, and the Ada County Sheriff. Mayor John Stearns replies to Sheriff Angus that, yeah, Mr. Ijams came here in March asking for a good cowboy and I recommended George Dunning. In Mayor Stearns' words, "I'm very sorry he has got into trouble and do not think he went there for that purpose, as he never was known in this country as a man who was looking for trouble." Henry DeMint, George's friend from Idaho, also writes to Sheriff Angus and sends him the letters George received from Ijams before the invasion kicked off. Sheriff Angus had to realize how valuable George was to his case. He hadn't been permitted to interview any of the men currently in Army custody. George's testimony was Sheriff Angus's best shot at getting any charges to stick. And details are beginning to leak out about the scope of the invasion and just who knew about it. As one newspaper at the time put it, the invasion proves to be a more diabolical conspiracy than was ever imagined and was planned as carefully as a war between two nations. George is kept as a prisoner in Buffalo, probably so that Sheriff Angus can make sure nothing happens to his star witness. While in custody, George writes a 44-page confession detailing his recruitment and his experience as a member of what he calls the mob. In Cheyenne, the invaders are represented by Willis Van Devanter, a young hotshot attorney. Van Devanter believed, and he was probably right, that if the invaders had a speedy jury trial, they would probably be convicted. His strategy is to delay and make sure the cases never get to trial. First, he files a change of venue. He argues that in Johnson County, the invaders will never get a fair trial and says that Cheyenne is a better alternative. The Johnson County District Attorney is like, yeah, right, that's home base for these guys' employers, but the judge rules in favor of Cheyenne. Next, as jury selection for the trial begins, the local sheriff petitions the court and says he can no longer afford to feed and house the defendants. Since it's Johnson County's case, they should have to pay for all that. But Johnson County is one of the poorest in the state. There's no way they could afford to house dozens of prisoners for months. The judge allows the defendants to be released on their own recognizance. The Texans promptly disappear, never to be seen in Wyoming again. The court case drags on for months, with several continuances being filed. The opposing sides were able to get 11 jurors, but it became apparent that there weren't going to be enough jurors to try the case. The prosecutor moved for dismissal. Van Devanter objected. He knew that if the charges were dismissed without an impaneled jury, they could be brought again in the future. The court picked a guy, literally some random guy, put him on the jury to get the needed 12, and then the case against the invaders was officially dismissed for good. And that's why they call it a legal system and not a justice system. Now, the failure of the court case didn't mean all was forgotten. In 1892 was an election year. The invasion forced many to rethink their ideas about what unchecked rich people in a complicit government could do to ordinary people's lives. For example, Asa Mercer, the owner of the Northwestern Livestock Journal, had been a reliable mouthpiece for the WSGA and the wealthy cattle barons for years. In fact, he had gone on record supporting Ellen Watson and James Averill's lynchings. But something about the invasion changed him. It's not exactly for certain why. Maybe he saw which way the popular winds were blowing. Maybe it was a crisis of conscience. Or maybe it was because several of the WSGA's men punched him in the face in his own office. But by the summer of 1892, Mercer was publishing furious criticisms of the WSGA and the government. He got his biggest scoop in October, 1 month before the election, when he published George Dunning's entire confession in his paper. Honestly, most people by this point had already made up their minds. Historically, Wyoming has been and still is a conservative territory and state that reliably votes Republican. But with the highest levels of the state government implicated in the scandal, the voters cleaned house. Governor Barber, gone. Senator Warren, gone. For any election in 1892, if you were the Republican candidate, odds were you weren't getting elected. As their new governor, the citizens of Wyoming selected John Osborne, the Democrat Party nominee and a doctor. At his inaugural ball, Governor Osborne wore a pair of shoes made from the skin of this guy, Big-Nosed George Parrott. That's probably a story for a different day. The final shot of the Johnson County War came the next year, and like most of this saga, it blurs the line between cattle warfare and personal vendetta. In May, Dudley Champion, one of Nate Champion's brothers, got into an argument with Mike Chauncey, the ranch foreman that had led the invaders to the KC Ranch. Like almost everything else in this war, the version of the story you get depends on the point of view of who's telling it. According to Champion's supporters, he was gunned down by Chauncey without provocation. The coroner's jury found that Chauncey acted in self-defense. After he killed Dudley Champion, Mike Chauncey left Wyoming for Nebraska, where he continued cattle raising. Frank Walcott also went to Nebraska and died in Colorado in 1910. Tom Smith was shot and killed in 1893, and Mr. Brooks, the Texas kid who shot Nick Ray, was hanged after killing a woman in 1894. Frank Canton left Wyoming for good after the war and worked as a deputy U.S. Marshal in Oklahoma. Fred Hess stayed and continued working in Johnson County. Today he's buried in Buffalo, just a few yards away from Nate Champion and Nick Ray. In 1894, Asa Mercer, the newspaper guy who published George Dunning's confession, wrote a book titled The Banditti of the Plains, or The Cattlemen's Invasion of Wyoming in 1892. Although it's not hard to see where Mercer's sympathies lie, the book accurately documents a lot of the evidence and circumstances that occurred up to and through 1892. Supposedly, the book was so inflammatory upon its publishing that copies of the book were burned and the book was suppressed. Mercer lived out the rest of his days as a small-time Wyoming rancher. The backlash against the Republicans and Wyoming government only lasted a few years. Francis Warren was re-elected as a senator in the next election and served in Washington, D.C. until 1929. Fort D.A. Russell was renamed after him and is now an Air Force base. Willis Van Devanter, the lawyer who was able to stop the criminal case against the invaders, eventually became a Supreme Court justice. After the Johnson County War, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had no choice but to cave to outside pressure. In 1893, it opened its membership to small ranchers. The WSGA is still active today and advocates for the livestock industry throughout Wyoming. The only requirements to be a voting member are that you own at least one head of stock and you pay a $125 fee. And what about George Dunning? Well, after his release, George went back to Idaho. He continued working different jobs to make ends meet and was still called on by law enforcement when they needed a tough man to track down bandits.
When he went back to Idaho, it's just kind of like he just returned to Idaho and kind of started taking up living again. He was of good character. He wasn't a rowdy guy. He had a good reputation. He worked hard. He tried everything he could to make a living, a school teacher, a ferry boat owner, a miner, a cattleman, part of the Stockmen's Association. So he was doing everything he could to have a decent living. I could never find out where he was buried. So when I drove over to Jordan Valley, it was 80 miles from Boise, I drove into the cemetery and I was a little bit overwhelmed because it was big. Lots of graves up and down kind of little beautiful hills overlooking the valley. Just as I was kind of in a dilemma, here comes the gardener that was going to mow the lawn. And I asked him, could you help me? I'm looking for someone that's buried here. He says, no, I'm too busy. He walked about 5 steps, and then he turned around and said, what was the name? And I said, George Dunning. He said, follow me. We walked up. There he was, buried right on the top of the hill, overlooking the beautiful valley that he loves. So I was just so relieved to find him because I kind of felt like that was the end of the story. That's what I was looking for, trying to find him because he was family. And that's the end of the story.
There are a bunch of lessons learned that we can pull from the Johnson County War story. Lessons that aren't just for people back then, but that apply to us here and now. And now's your chance to tell me what you think they are. What's the lessons that we should learn from the Johnson County War, and how should we apply it today? Leave a comment with what you think the Johnson County War can teach us. And while you're doing that, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button down there and the thumbs up button so you get notified when the next Story Out West video drops. Thanks for watching.